In 1994, the media did not report Kurt Cobain's death. They packaged it, 37 words. That was all it took. Rock star Kurt Cobain dead, at 27. Drug-addicted Nirvana singer found in Seattle home. Not an artist, not a father, not a man who had spent 27 years trying to make the world understand what he was actually saying. A drug-addicted rock star. A problem solved. What we were told was the simplest possible version of events. What was omitted changed the entire meaning of the story, and what was omitted was deliberate, not a conspiracy, but something in some ways more troubling, a system that had no incentive to ask harder questions, and every incentive not to. This is what that system buried. Start here. It did not say that Kurt Cobain had been living with undiagnosed chronic stomach pain since he was a teenager, a condition so debilitating that doctors across 2 countries failed to identify it for nearly a decade. It did not say that heroin entered his life not as a recreational choice, but as the only substance that quieted the kind of physical agony that made standing upright feel like a victory. It did not say that the music industry had spent 3 years packaging a man who described himself as a punk into a product called grunge, and that the distance between those 2 identities had been widening every single day like a fault line waiting to give. The headline said what was easiest to say, and what was easiest to say was also the least true version of the story that existed. The machine that ran on simplicity. The logic was simple. Watch how it worked in practice. In 1994, the media ecosystem that received the news of Kurt Cobain's death operated according to a logic that had nothing to do with complexity. Rolling Stone had put him on the cover multiple times, always the tortured artist, always the reluctant icon, always framed through the lens of excess and self-destruction. MTV ran memorial programming within hours, cycling through the same footage, the Nevermind-era interviews where he looked uncomfortable, the live performances where he looked uncomfortable, the public moments where he looked uncomfortable. The through line the media had established years before his death became the through line of his obituary. The man had been uncomfortable. That was the story. That was always the story. This is where the story changes. What was systematically absent from the coverage was structural context. The music industry in 1994 was not a neutral backdrop to Kurt Cobain's personal struggles. It was an active force shaping those struggles in real time. DGC Records had taken a band that emerged from the underground punk scene of Aberdeen and positioned them as the voice of a generation, a commercial category, a demographic product. The marketing of Nevermind was a machine with very little interest in what Kurt Cobain actually wanted to say, and significant interest in how many units his discomfort could move. When he spoke publicly about hating the album's polished production, about feeling it represented someone else's vision of who he was, those statements were reported as curiosities rather than as evidence of a structural contradiction the industry had created and refused to resolve. The media covered his complaints about fame as a quirk of his personality rather than a legitimate critique of the system he had been absorbed into. Here is the moment the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Rome incident in March 1994, 37 days before his death, offers the clearest example of how this simplification operated in real time. When Cobain was found unresponsive in his hotel room after ingesting a dangerous combination of champagne and Rohypnol, the initial coverage described it as an accidental overdose. The word accidental did significant work in that framing. It prevented any serious interrogation of what had actually happened in that room, who had known what and when, and whether the people around Cobain had responded with the urgency the situation demanded. The harder questions were never asked in any sustained way. The story was filed. The machine moved on. What the cameras never showed, there is a version of Kurt Cobain that the media of 1994 never had any institutional incentive to construct. And that version is also the most accurate one. He was a man who had experienced genuine childhood trauma in a small Washington town where the economic decline of the 1980s had stripped away whatever stability the community might once have offered. He was someone who discovered music not as a career path, but as the only available language for processing experiences that had no other outlet. He was physically ill in a way that his doctors could not adequately address, which meant that the substance use that would later become the central fact of his public identity began as a desperate attempt to manage pain that nobody around him fully understood. And then this is the fact that received the least coverage of all. He was openly bisexual, at a time when that declaration in rock music invited not celebration, but active hostility, something he had experienced directly in the form of threats that never made the front pages. None of this fit the available template. The available template, in 1994, was the rock star who had everything and threw it away. That template was familiar. It was monetizable, and it required no actual curiosity about the human being at its center. Kurt Cobain was not the first artist to be processed through this machine, and he would not be the last, but the speed and totality with which his narrative was flattened into that shape remains striking 3 decades later. The Seattle music scene that had produced not just Nirvana, but Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and Pearl Jam was in the process of collapsing under the weight of what mainstream success had done to it. But that systemic story was not a story the mainstream media of 1994 had the vocabulary or the desire to tell. The myth and the man. By the time Kurt Cobain died, the myth of him had already developed a life entirely independent of the person. The myth was a suffering genius, a prophet of disillusionment, a Generation X mascot. The myth was useful. It sold magazines, it generated ratings, and after his death, it would generate a category of retrospective coverage that continued on a reliable cycle for the next 30 years. But the myth had a particular feature that made it dangerous. It consistently located the source of his suffering inside his own psychology and his own choices, rather than examining the environments and systems that had shaped those choices and made certain outcomes more likely than others. Here is what that framing actually does. When the media frames a story as being fundamentally about individual failure, about a person who could not handle success, who chose substances over stability, who refused help, it removes any obligation to ask harder questions. It removes the obligation to examine what kind of help was actually available and in what form. It removes the obligation to look at the music industry's standard procedures for managing artists who were showing clear signs of psychological and physical crisis. It removes the obligation to consider what it meant that a man was being told his identity was commercially valuable at precisely the moment when he was losing his grip on what that identity even was. The individual failure narrative is, in a practical sense, the narrative that protects the most powerful actors in any given story. If it happened today, the question of what would be different if Kurt Cobain died in 2024 rather than 1994 is genuinely complicated. And the honest answer is that it would not simply be better. The gatekeeping function of the mainstream media, the 37-word headline delivered to a passive audience, would be largely gone. Within hours of any equivalent event today, independent journalists, music historians, and former bandmates would be producing content that reflected the full complexity of the situation, the structural critique, the industry's role, the commodification of a subculture, the inadequacy of available mental health resources for working musicians would find an audience because the internet is large enough to contain audiences for serious analysis. But the same information environment that allows for that complexity also allows for something far less constructive. The conspiracy apparatus that exists around Kurt Cobain's death would be operating at a scale and velocity that 1994 simply could not have produced. Social media would have turned every ambiguous detail into a battlefield. Courtney Love would have been subjected to a level of coordinated harassment that would make the 1994 tabloid treatment look restrained. Frances Bean, 20 months old in April 1994, would have been born into an information environment where the most painful moment of her family's history was being processed in real time by millions of strangers, with almost no accountability for what they chose to say. Who controls the story? The deeper question underneath all of this is not really about technology. It is about who has the authority to define what a story means, and what interests are served by the definitions that get established and repeated. In 1994, that authority was concentrated in a relatively small number of editorial rooms, and the decisions made in those rooms reflected the institutional priorities of organizations deeply embedded in the commercial culture they were supposedly covering. The simplification of Kurt Cobain's story was not a conspiracy. It was a structural outcome. The people who wrote those 37-word headlines were not lying, exactly. They were operating within a framework of assumptions about what stories were for and who they served. And within that framework, complexity was not a virtue. It was an obstacle. Today, that authority is genuinely more distributed, and that distribution has produced real value. The long-form documentary work, the academic analysis, the survivor testimony from people who worked alongside artists during this era, all of it has contributed to a richer understanding of what actually happened in the Seattle music scene between 1989 and 1994. Kurt Cobain's chronic illness, his bisexual identity, his genuine ideological conflict with the commercial mechanisms that had made him famous. These are now part of the serious conversation about his life, in a way that they simply were not in April 9. That is real progress. The myth we were given, and the man we never met. 3 decades later, a person who was a teenager in 1994 and watched the news coverage in real time is now old enough to understand what was absent from it. They understand now that the media gave them a myth calibrated for easy consumption, a way of processing collective grief without actually asking the harder questions that genuine understanding would have required. The myth was the suffering genius. The man was something more difficult and more interesting, someone trying to survive inside contradictions that the world around him had created, and that he had no adequate tools to navigate. He was physically sick in ways nobody could diagnose. He was artistically compromised in ways nobody in power wanted to address. He was emotionally exhausted in ways that the available vocabulary for discussing mental health in 1994 could not adequately describe. What the cameras showed was the performance. What they never showed was the cost of maintaining it. What the headlines captured was the ending. What they never captured was the logic of the years that led there, the accumulated weight of unaddressed physical pain, unresolved identity conflict, and institutional indifference dressed up as support. The story that gets told is almost always the story that available incentives make easiest to tell. The real story is always more structural, always more about systems than individuals. And the real story, in 1994 as in 2024, requires the most from the people willing to look for it. Maybe what we knew was never Kurt Cobain at all. Maybe what we knew was the version of him that was built to be sold. And maybe 30 years later, it is finally worth asking what the difference between those two things actually was.